Keanu Reeves approached the luxury cruise, dressed simply in jeans and a jacket. The evening was a star-studded affair hosted by his close friend, Leonardo DiCaprio. But when he reached the entrance, he realized he had forgotten his invitation. The security guard, unmoved by Keanu's reputation, refused to let him pass. Keanu stayed calm, unfazed by the growing crowd of well-dressed celebrities flowing past him. Despite the setback, his humility and patience spoke volumes. What happened next would prove a powerful reminder of the value of character over appearance. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you enjoy uplifting stories like this, be sure to subscribe. Another amazing story is coming your way tomorrow. Keanu Reeves drove along the quiet coastal road, his old dependable car humming softly beneath him. The evening air was crisp, and a golden sunset painted the horizon. As he rounded the last bend, the sight of the luxury cruise ship came into view, an enormous, gleaming vessel bobbing gently in the harbor. Its bright lights sparkled like a constellation on the water. He smiled to himself, thinking about the friends he'd see inside. Leonardo, as always, had outdone himself with the gathering. Actors, directors, musicians. The ship was sure to be brimming with creative energy. It was the kind of event that most people would dress to impress for, but Keanu hadn't given it much thought. For him, clothes were just that, clothes. He wasn't one to fuss over fashion or make a grand entrance. He wore his favorite pair of jeans, a plain dark jacket, and a comfortable shirt. His hair was neatly combed back, and his usual down-to-earth demeanor made him appear as calm and approachable as ever. He felt at ease, looking forward to catching up with old friends, swapping stories, and sharing a few laughs. As he pulled into the dock's small parking area, he patted his pocket to check for the invitation card. That's when it hit him. He froze, a knot tightening in his stomach. The card wasn't there. He remembered placing it on the counter the day before, but in his rush to leave home, it had completely slipped his mind. Keanu sat back in his seat, glancing at the ship in the distance. He chuckled softly to himself. Of course he'd forget. He was never one to focus on the small details. For a moment, he considered heading back home to retrieve it, but it was a long drive. Besides, he thought, Leo would surely vouch for him. After all, they'd known each other for years. Confidence renewed, he stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. He walked toward the entrance, passing by the sleek black sedans and gleaming sports cars that had ferried other guests. His was the only car that seemed to carry a whiff of ordinary life. Keanu didn't care. To him, it wasn't about appearances. He waved casually at a few people he recognized, earning some surprised but friendly nods in return. He was, after all, Keanu Reeves, an actor, a friend, and someone who was well loved in Hollywood for his kindness and humility. When he reached the checkpoint, however, things didn't go quite as he expected. A burly security guard stood at the entrance, clipboard in hand, scanning each guest's invitation before allowing them to pass. The man looked up as Keanu approached, a practiced, neutral expression on his face. "Good evening," Keanu said with a polite smile. "I'm here for the event. I'm afraid I left my invitation at home." The guard didn't flinch. He had heard all kinds of excuses before, and the policy was clear. No invitation, no entry. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard replied, his tone firm but professional. "If you don't have the proper credentials, I can't let you in." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression still friendly. "I understand. I'm actually friends with the host, Leonardo DiCaprio. If you could just check with him." "Without the invitation," the guard interrupted, "I can't verify who you are. Rules are rules." Keanu paused, studying the guard's face. He could see the man wasn't being unkind. He was simply doing his job. He gave a small nod. "Of course. I'll wait here. Thank you." He stepped to the side, letting the other guests pass. Many were dressed in designer gowns and sharp suits, and they moved with a confident air, holding their invitations like golden tickets. Some glanced at Keanu, seemingly recognizing him, but no one said anything. He leaned against the railing, hands in his pockets, as if he had all the time in the world. Even as the line dwindled, Keanu didn't lose his calm. He didn't argue or push for special treatment. He simply waited, quietly observing the scene. He watched as other guests exchanged polite greetings and laughter, their high spirits filling the air. He remained a figure of quiet humility amid the glamour and glitz, a reminder that status and reputation mean little when stripped of outward symbols. The security guard, though, remained focused on his task. To him, Keanu was just another man without the required proof. Without that small card, it didn't matter who he claimed to be. The guard wasn't being rude, he was just doing his duty. For Keanu, this was not a confrontation, but a moment to reflect. It wasn't the first time he'd been overlooked or misunderstood. It wouldn't be the last. What mattered was how he responded. So he stood there, unhurried and unbothered, waiting for the universe to take its course. Standing just outside the roped-off entrance, Keanu Reeves took a deep breath. The light ocean breeze barely reached him as he stepped to the side to let another wave of glamorous guests pass. He gave a slight nod to a few people he recognized, though they seemed too caught up in their own conversations to notice him. He wasn't one to make a scene, but it was clear now that the situation wouldn't resolve itself quickly. As much as he hated to do it, he figured a phone call might be the easiest way to settle this quietly. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Leo's number. This was his event, after all, and there was no way he'd want Keanu to be turned away over something as small as a forgotten invitation card. Keanu pressed the call button and waited. Ring after ring passed, but there was no answer. Just as voicemail clicked on, Keanu ended the call and sighed. He knew Leo was likely busy hosting, mingling, and keeping the party running smoothly. Still, it left him in an awkward position. He considered calling again, but decided to give it a few minutes. Maybe Leo would notice the missed call and ring back. The security guard was still standing by the checkpoint, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the steady stream of arrivals. His jaw was set in that same neutral expression he'd worn since Keanu first approached. It was clear he was the kind of guy who took his job seriously. Rules were rules, and he wasn't about to bend them for anyone. That much was certain. Keanu slid his phone back into his pocket. He figured he'd try speaking to the guard again. Maybe there was a way to smooth things over without having to rely on Leo. With his usual calm demeanor, he walked back over and gave the man a polite smile. "Excuse me," Keanu began, his tone respectful and friendly. "I know you have a job to do, and I don't want to cause any trouble. I just forgot my invitation at home, but I promise I'm supposed to be on the guest list. Is there any way you can confirm with someone inside? Maybe they can vouch for me." The guard barely glanced at him this time. "I told you before," he replied firmly. "Without an invitation, I can't let you in. If you want to wait for someone to come out and get you, fine. But until then, my hands are tied." Keanu nodded, understanding that the man was only following protocol. Still, the situation was starting to draw more attention. A few guests looked over, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a Hollywood star stuck outside. Keanu's patience hadn't wavered, but he could sense the growing tension. He gave it another few minutes, then tried Leo's number again. This time it went straight to voicemail. No luck. Keanu stared at his phone, debating whether to try someone else, but Leo was the host. He was the only one who could make this right. When Keanu returned to the guard once more, he tried a different approach. "Look, I don't mean to put you in a tough spot," he said, his voice steady and kind. "I'm not asking you to break any rules. I just need a chance to explain things. Maybe you could call someone higher up just to verify. I'm sure they'll know I'm supposed to be here." The guard's neutral expression faltered slightly. He glanced at the clipboard, then back at Keanu. "Sir," he said, his tone growing more clipped, "I've told you twice now. Without an invitation, you can't enter. And if you keep pressing, I'll have to call my supervisor. Is that what you want?" Keanu opened his mouth to reply, but the guard raised his hand. "Hold on. Just stay put. I'm calling my boss." The guard pulled out a walkie-talkie and stepped a few paces away, speaking in a low, tense voice. It was clear from his body language that the situation was starting to weigh on him. His shoulders stiffened, his movements became sharper, and his tone edged toward irritation. Keanu waited patiently, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't upset, nor did he feel the need to argue. He simply waited. He'd been in tougher situations before. This was just a temporary inconvenience. When the guard returned, his face was tight. My supervisor says we stick to the rules. No invitation, no entry. So unless you can produce that card, there's nothing I can do. Keanu nodded. I understand, he said softly. Thanks for checking. The calm response seemed to catch the guard off guard. He expected pushback, an argument, maybe even an entitled demand to let him through. Instead, Keanu remained composed, even kind. But as time dragged on, the guard's frustration began to surface. Another guest arrived, her invitation card gleaming as she handed it over. The guard barely looked at it before waving her through. He glanced at Keanu, still standing to the side, and his patience seemed to wear thin. Sir, the guard said, his tone now sharper. If you're not leaving or showing me an invitation, I'm going to have to escalate this further. Keanu raised an eyebrow. I'm just waiting, he replied, still calm. I'm not causing any trouble. But the guard didn't see it that way. He muttered something under his breath, then reached for his radio again. Keanu overheard bits of the conversation, something about an uncooperative guest and further action. It wasn't long before the man turned back to Keanu, his expression stern. I've had enough, the guard said firmly. I'm calling the authorities. You can explain it to them. Keanu blinked, surprised at how quickly things had escalated. He held up his hands, palms out, in a gesture of peace. There's no need for that, he said evenly. I'm not here to cause problems. But the guard had already turned away, speaking into his radio. Within minutes, the flashing lights of a police car approached the dock. A pair of uniformed officers stepped out, their faces calm but focused. Keanu remained still, his demeanor unchanged. He greeted the officers politely as they approached, explaining the situation as clearly as he could. They listened carefully, their expressions neutral, before stepping aside to confer. It was clear they were trying to determine how best to handle this unexpected situation. For Keanu, it was all starting to feel surreal. He had come to celebrate with friends, but now he found himself at the center of a misunderstanding that had spiraled far beyond what he had anticipated. Still, he remained steadfast in his approach, polite, patient, and willing to wait for the truth to come to light. The officers eventually returned to speak with both the guard and Keanu, but it was clear that this wasn't a matter of law-breaking. It was simply a misunderstanding over a missing piece of paper. And yet, the way it had escalated served as a stark reminder of how easily assumptions and procedures can cloud judgment. The policeman stood on the dock, squinting under the bright lights spilling out from the cruise ship. They'd been called in for what was described as a guest refusing to leave, but now, seeing the man in question, they immediately recognized him. It was Keanu Reeves, the movie star known the world over. One of the officers raised an eyebrow and muttered to his partner, "That's John Wick, isn't it?" Keanu stood calmly to the side, his hands resting in his jacket pockets, watching the officers as they approached. The guard, who was still clutching his clipboard, seemed to grow more rigid when the officers began speaking to Keanu directly. "Mr. Reeves," one of the policemen said, his voice respectful. "What seems to be the trouble here?" Keanu gave them a polite nod. "It's nothing serious. I forgot my invitation for the event. The security guard here was just doing his job and wouldn't let me in without it." His tone was even and calm, as though explaining something completely ordinary. The officer nodded, glancing back at the guard, who looked increasingly uneasy. "All right," the officer said. "How about we get the events manager down here to help sort this out?" The guard stiffened. "There's no need for that," he insisted. "He didn't have an invitation, and that's all there is to it." But the officer held up his hand. "Let's not jump to conclusions. If he's on the guest list, we'll sort it out. Besides, you know who this is, right?" The guard hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't care who he says he is. If he doesn't have the proper credentials, he's not getting on board." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "Let's just check with the cruise manager. That way we can make sure we're following the right procedures." With that, the officer pulled out his radio and made a call. Keanu stayed quiet, watching as the situation unfolded. He could feel the attention on him growing, but he didn't let it faze him. It was clear to him now that this wasn't about rules so much as appearances. The guard didn't recognize him. He simply saw a man dressed casually, without the physical proof of an invitation, and assumed he didn't belong. It didn't take long for the cruise manager to appear, stepping down the gangway and onto the dock. The man looked flustered, his polished shoes tapping quickly on the wooden planks. As soon as he caught sight of Keanu, his face broke into a surprised but delighted smile. "Mr. Reeves, I'm so sorry for the confusion," the manager said, hurrying over to him. "I didn't realize you were already here. Please, let me escort you on board." Before Keanu could respond, another voice called out from behind the manager. "Keanu!" Leonardo DiCaprio emerged from the ship, a wide grin spreading across his face. Dressed in a sharp suit, he looked every bit the host of a glamorous Hollywood event. He strode down the gangway and reached out to shake Keanu's hand. "Man, I've been wondering where you were," Leo said. "Why are you out here?" Keanu smiled back. "I forgot my invitation, and this fine gentleman was just doing his job." Leonardo turned to the guard, who now looked thoroughly embarrassed. "He's with me," Leo said simply. "Please let him in." The guard stammered, his earlier confidence quickly fading. I'm sorry, I didn't realize." Leo cut him off with a gentle wave of his hand. "It's fine. You didn't know." He turned back to Keanu, his smile never wavering. "Come on, let's get you inside." The cruise manager gestured for the officers who were still standing by to step back. "Thank you, gentlemen. Sorry for the misunderstanding." As the officers turned to leave, one of them gave Keanu a small nod as if to say, "We knew you were all right." Keanu returned the nod with a slight smile, grateful for their calm approach. The guard, now standing awkwardly to the side, seemed to shrink under the weight of what had just happened. He was used to enforcing strict rules, but he'd been so focused on appearances, on the lack of a designer suit, a luxury car, or a physical invitation, that he hadn't stopped to consider the person in front of him. It was clear now that he had been too quick to judge, and his demeanor softened. He looked at Keanu and said, "Mr. Reeves, I'm really sorry. I should have handled this differently." Keanu, true to his nature, simply nodded. "No harm done," he said. "You were just doing your job." But the guard seemed to wrestle with his own guilt. "It's not just about doing my job," he admitted, his voice lower. "I judged you based on what you were wearing, and that wasn't fair." Keanu gave him a reassuring smile. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is how we learn from them." As Keanu turned to follow Leonardo and the cruise manager toward the ship, he glanced back at the guard, who now looked less like a rigid enforcer and more like someone who had learned a valuable lesson. The moment wasn't lost on him. Rules were important, yes, but so was the understanding that appearances don't define a person's worth. As Keanu stepped onto the luxurious deck, the tension that had followed him for the past hour began to melt away. The hum of friendly conversation and the faint sound of a string quartet drifted through the warm evening air. Above him, paper lanterns swayed gently, casting a soft glow over the party. Guests were chatting in groups, glasses of champagne in hand, their laughter blending with the ocean's calming rhythm. It wasn't long before a familiar voice called out to him. "Keanu, there you are." Keanu turned to see Sandra Bullock making her way through the crowd. She was radiant in a deep blue gown, her smile warm and genuine. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she teased, giving him a friendly hug. Keanu chuckled. "I had a bit of trouble getting in." Sandra pulled back slightly and raised an eyebrow. "Trouble? What kind of trouble?" He shrugged lightly. "Nothing I couldn't handle. Just a misunderstanding with the entrance." "Well, you're here now," Sandra said, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "And this party is just getting started." They wandered toward the railing where the city lights twinkled in the distance. Keanu felt the stress of the earlier incident slip further away as he caught up with Sandra, their conversation flowing easily, just as it always had. She told him about a film project she was working on, and he shared a story about a recent motorcycle trip through the mountains. It felt like old times, two friends reconnecting in the middle of the glamorous chaos. As the night wore on, Keanu couldn't help but reflect on the evening's events. Being stopped at the entrance had been frustrating, sure, but it was also a reminder of something important. He glanced around at the glittering crowd, each person dressed to impress, each carrying their own story. What struck him most was how easily people are judged by their appearances. If he had been wearing a designer tuxedo, the guard might never have questioned him. But the reality was that none of that should matter. Sandra seemed to sense his thoughtful pause. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, tilting her head with a curious smile. Keanu smiled back. "I was just thinking about how often we make snap judgments based on surface-level things. It's so easy to look at someone's clothes, or their car, or their title, and decide who they are before we even know them." Sandra nodded, her expression softening. "It's true. Sometimes we forget to look beyond what we see. But the good thing is, we can always choose to do better." Keanu considered her words. "I guess what really matters is how we treat each other. Not what someone's wearing or what they own, but how we show them respect and kindness. That's what lasts." Sandra raised her glass in a small toast to respect and kindness. Keanu clinked his glass lightly against hers, to treating each other like people, not just appearances. The two friends stood there, side by side, looking out at the ocean. The earlier stress seemed a distant memory now, replaced by a quiet understanding. It was the kind of moment that stayed with you long after the party ended, a reminder that humanity wasn't about wealth or status. It was about how we see each other, how we listen, and how we choose to care. And as the night went on, Keanu realized that being on that ship, surrounded by friends and good conversation, wasn't about fitting in with the glitz and glamour. It was about connection, shared laughter, and the simple truth that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. And as the night went on, Keanu realized that being on that ship, surrounded by friends and good conversation, wasn't about fitting in with the glitz and glamour. It was about connection, shared laughter, and the simple truth that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, tap the end screen to explore more inspiring tales of courage, humanity, and hope. Here is a brief of our last story. To watch it in full, go to the channel. Keanu Reeves stepped into a dimly lit KFC late at night, looking like any other exhausted customer. As he waited for his meal, he noticed two little girls sitting alone, looking scared and clutching a crumpled note. Something about their situation felt wrong. When he saw the younger one wipe away a tear, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Keanu approached them carefully, offering a drink, but they didn't touch it. Their fear was evident. He asked a cashier about them, and the young employee hesitantly admitted they had been sitting there since the morning, waiting for their mother. The manager and staff seemed uneasy, as if they knew something but were afraid to speak up. Keanu eventually got the older girl to slide the note over to him. It read, "Wait at KFC. Don't leave. I will come for you, Mom." The words sent a chill down his spine. Their mother had told them to wait, but it had been hours. Something was terribly wrong. His suspicions deepened when he looked outside and saw a man across the street, standing still, watching the restaurant. The way he waited, unmoving, sent alarm bells through Keanu's mind. Was he connected to the mother's disappearance? Was he waiting for the girls? Keanu acted fast. He walked to the counter and demanded to use the phone. The manager hesitated but relented. Keanu called the authorities, explaining the situation and stressing the urgency. However, the dispatcher didn't seem to take it as seriously as he hoped. Just then, the restaurant's phone rang. The employee who answered went pale before handing it to Keanu. On the other end, a desperate voice whispered, "Please, please tell me they're still there." It was their mother. She was alive, but she was terrified. Keanu assured her that her daughters were safe. She was out of breath, on the run. "He's here too," she whispered, confirming Keanu's worst fears. The man outside was hunting her and her daughters. Keanu instructed her to come through the side door immediately. Moments later, the side door swung open and a disheveled woman rushed in. The moment she saw her daughters, she collapsed in relief, embracing them tightly. Their cries of joy and sorrow filled the room. Keanu didn't interrupt but observed. When she looked up at him, tears in her eyes, she whispered, "Thank you." He asked her what had happened. The mother hesitated, then admitted the truth. Her abusive partner, the girl's stepfather, had locked her inside their home, threatening that if she ever tried to leave, she'd never see her daughters again. She had waited for him to fall asleep before climbing out the window and running for her life. Keanu glanced back out the window. The man was still there, watching, waiting. Keanu acted immediately. He called someone he trusted, someone who could help. Within minutes, a black car pulled up outside. The mother hesitated, afraid to trust, but Keanu reassured her. "You're leaving tonight," he said firmly. "You're going somewhere safe." Tears streamed down her face as she thanked him again. She and her daughters climbed into the car, their hands still tightly gripping his before they let go. The car disappeared into the night, taking them to safety. Keanu turned back toward the restaurant. The stepfather, realizing the girls were gone, flicked his cigarette to the ground and vanished into the shadows. He wasn't giving up, but neither was Keanu. He had bought them time, and now they had a real chance at freedom. As Keanu walked away, blending into the city's rhythm once more, he knew that some heroes don't wear capes. They just happen to be in the right place at the right time.